And you see, of course, the effects of this gender confusion, which has been going on for a long time. It hasn't been in the mainstream media or hasn't been promoted quite as aggressively as it has in recent years. But the idea that a man, it's okay for him to become increasingly effeminate as a woman takes a more dominant masculine role. We see this in a lot of European countries, not so much in the Eastern European countries. And you see that really going hand in hand with declining fertility.
Thanks for joining the Father Emmanuel Lemelson Podcast, which reveals the darkest corners of government, corporate America, and culture with commentary from an Orthodox Christian perspective. Join our co-host, Theodora Lemelson, for another thought-provoking episode as we explore the pressing issue of infertility among Europeans and the rise of Eurabia. If you value our content, please like, share, or comment, and remember to follow us on social media.
We are sick and tired of democracy, and we are here to provide you an alternative, and that is the Sharia. That is Islam. Oh, people of Britain, take a look around you. Do you not see the corruption? Do you not see the oppression? Look to how your democracy, it failed in the coalition government. Look to how your democracy, it failed when all of you wanted no war in Iraq. Oh, people of Britain, wake up. We as the Muslims have woken up a long time ago, and we are here to tell you that we will never stop struggling. We will never stop calling. We will never stop striving until the black flag of Islam is all over the world.
Commentator Eva Vladingerbroek delivered a speech at CPAC Hungary last month titled, quote, "The Great Replacement is not a theory, it's a reality." She discussed the recent crime wave in Europe and named mass migration as one of its primary causes. Her speech, though carefully worded, implicates immigrants from Islamic countries. Here is a clip from her speech.
Our new reality in Europe consists of frequent rapes, stabbings, killings, murders, shootings, even beheadings. But let me be clear about one thing. This did not used to happen before. This is a newly imported problem.
According to a recent global fertility study published in the international medical journal The Lancet, quote, "Fertility is declining globally, with rates in more than half of all countries and territories in 2021 below replacement level," end quote. The March report based its predictions on the widely accepted premise that countries require a total fertility rate, TFR, of 2.1 children per woman in order to ensure a stable population. However, in Western Europe, TFR is forecast to drop from 1.53, where it was in 2021, to 1.44 in 2050. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has referenced, quote, "the Great Replacement theory" in advocating for improving birth rates in Europe. Orbán has rejected the notion of 21st century Europe being populated by non-Europeans, saying, quote, "If Europe is not going to be populated by Europeans in the future, and we take this as given, then we're speaking about an exchange of populations to replace the population of Europeans with others," end quote. Is there a, quote, "great replacement" taking place in Europe? What are the drivers? And if so, what are the implications for the United States?
Well, if it's a demographic reality, then it can't be a theory, much less a conspiracy theory. Much of what she's saying is true in terms of the facts of immigration in Europe, but I think the problem people have with this concept is that it seems to blame the immigrant population. And, when you have 37.5% of London being foreign-born, I think those are the numbers. I think Belgium, it's about the same. I believe 80% of the people under the age of 18 in Belgium have one parent who is not Belgian. And of that, 60% are not even European. And I think in the Netherlands, I want to say in Rotterdam, Amsterdam, I think 1/3 of the population are all foreign-born. I believe she cites slightly different statistics, but the message is clear. There is a exchange of populations in Europe and in most European countries. Part of that is driven by open border policies. But I would submit that the greater reason is that Europe has, since World War II, largely turned it back on its own cultural and religious heritage. And we see this in declining religious observance. We see this in a decline in the number of people who identify as Christian, who associate with the church, who are members of a church, who baptize their children. Those numbers are falling off a cliff. If we look at the Netherlands, just as a case study, because she happens to be from the Netherlands, crime existed in that country before the immigrant population showed up. Look at the red light district, how many thousands of girls, teenage girls, have been trafficked through there. Look at the widespread drug use. Or more importantly, as we see the decline in identification with Christian morality and ethics, look at the rise of euthanasia in that country. They're now putting people to death who are perfectly healthy young people because they have some sort of mental torment or mental anguish. Look at the case of Zaraya Terbeek, for example. She was the same age as Eva. She was 28. I think she was 29. She was just recently euthanized, perfectly healthy. She was surrounded by a cult of death. She was surrounded by purported doctors. I don't know, you can call them doctors. They never heard of the Hippocratic Oath, I guess, who told her there was nothing more they can do, that the situation was hopeless, and her only alternative, apparently this is what they said, according to the media reports, that there was no hope. And she suffered from anxiety and depression. Give me a break. Both are treatable. She was put to death. What will be next? Will it be Down syndrome? Will it be autistic children? So I would ask one question. In the Netherlands, of all the people who've applied for euthanasia, and that number has gone up since 2010, the number of people who've been euthanized for psychological reasons up 7,000% since 2010, I would ask one question. How many are Muslim? You know what? I bet you the number is 0. So I would say, how do you blame the Muslim immigrant population for that? Now, don't just take that as a defense of Islam. I know what Islam is. It's a very, very different religion from Christianity. But unless the Europeans and Americans as well return to church, right? As Christ says, you're either with me or you're against me. That's pretty clear. And when you look at the Catholic bishops in the Netherlands saying that in the next 5 years, we're going to close 60% of the churches, the writing is on the wall. Absolute collapse in religious affiliation with the Christian church. I think 60% of the Dutch population now is considered irreligious, which is a little bit of a misleading term because what replaces religion proper, Christianity in this case, is a persistent agnosticism, a neo-paganism, or even a militaristic atheism. And that certainly creates a spiritual and cultural vacuum. Now, we see it in London, we see it in Paris, we see it in Brussels, you see it in Germany, you see it in Sweden. Sweden is unrecognizable from 10 years ago. And I think this idea amongst Europeans, it was almost like virtue signaling, that if we had let them in, if we taken all of these immigrants, many of them from war-torn countries, but many from either North Africa or Muslim countries in the Middle East, that they would assimilate. I think that was incredibly naive, and I wonder if any politicians, when they instituted these policies, asked these populations, even a sampling of them, are you interested in integrating? Are you interested in assimilation? I think they would have gotten very clear answers, because the answers are no. And that dovetails very clearly with the fertility problem in Europe, which I think in the Eurozone, it's 1.5 roughly. The replacement rate to keep a stable population is 2.1. I think that's universally accepted. It's not unique just to Europe. You see the same problem in East Asia. But looking at sort of the decline of Western civilization in Europe as we know it, you look at some of the most poignant examples are in Greece, where the fertility rate amongst women is 1.39, so markedly lower than the rest of the Eurozone. And I really don't think it has anything to do with the usual suspects which are put forward, that somehow young men cannot get married because their pension, part of the pension they're going to receive from their parents or real estate they're going to inherit, they haven't been able to do that. And Greece has gotten poorer since the financial crisis in 2009. That's kind of nonsense, because prior to the 1970s, Greece did not have a fertility issue. It was a poorer country. In 1948, for example, I think there was over 200,000 births. I think that number is 86,000 in 2021. Huge decline. I believe there was, I want to say 58,000 more deaths than births in Greece in 2021, but that excludes an important number. It excludes the number of Greek babies murdered in the womb, which was 36,400 the same year. So you're talking about 100,000 deaths, with about 40% being preventable. And it's really interesting because here's, Orthodox Greece, right? And this huge population that is Orthodox, part of the most beautiful, richest, most full manifestation of the church that Christ established on earth. And it's sitting just south of Albania, which actually has a considerable Muslim population. In fact, it's the majority of the population is Muslim. I think 60% identify as Muslim. And they have the lowest rates of abortion in the world, second only to Algeria, so the second lowest. And the Muslims simply don't have a fertility problem. They're not euthanizing their young people. I want to say the majority of the median age of the Muslim immigrants in Europe is around 30. I think the European median age is around 44 or 45. If you look at women born in 1975, a year before I was born, in Greece, I think a full 24 or 25% are childless. These are really shocking numbers. And you see, of course, the effects of this gender confusion, which has been going on for a long time. It hasn't been in the mainstream media or hasn't been promoted quite as aggressively as it has in recent years. But the idea that a man, it's okay for him to become increasingly effeminate as a woman takes a more dominant masculine role. We see this in a lot of European countries. not so much in the Eastern European countries. And you see that really going hand in hand with declining fertility. And so you look at poor countries in Africa, they don't have a fertility problem, right? They're having children. Children are such an incredible blessing, such an enormous blessing. I think we have a culture now and a cultural problem where the more we turn our backs on the church and the teachings of the church, the more we turn our backs on holy tradition, the more we turn our backs on what we learn from the church and her wisdom about family life, the more you're going to see that birth rate decline. And pinning it on Islamic immigrants is silly, or thinking that you're going to find a political policy solution to it is equally absurd, because a culture which hates itself, which hates its own religion, a culture in a society which turns its back on Christ, which turns its churches into mosques, as they're being done in Ireland, or into bars or apartment buildings, what do you expect to happen? Muslims show up and they say, you don't have religion? Great, we'll give you religion. What do you expect them to say? We're going to assimilate? Assimilate into what? So it's a pretty remarkable situation going on in Europe. I think it's really misleading not to look at what's actually happening to the culture. When you see, for example, Greek politicians espousing the virtues of the LGBTQ agenda, rather than espousing the virtue of marriage and family life, you've got a problem. You've got leading politicians on the left in Greece who are, it's literally constantly in your face. You've got, of course, the same-sex marriage law, which was recently passed in Greece. You Google Mitsotakis holding a child, guess what? You won't find a single picture of him holding a child, except his own child and his own family. Google Donald Trump holding a child. He's holding children all the time. Google Viktor Orban, same thing. You don't like Putin? Well, you know what? Google Putin with children. You'll find him kissing and hugging children, but not in Greece, not in Orthodox family-oriented Greece. So that is really the driver right there. And the Muslim population is exploding. In 1900, I want to say there was 200 million Muslims worldwide. I think it's 12% of the global population. I think by 2030, it's expected to be 2.2 billion, a tenfold increase. I think 2050, it's estimated 2.8 billion. It'll be 1/3 of the world's population. Not a fertility problem, not a euthanasia problem. They're not killing themselves. So Christians ought to take a hard look at that while there's still time, because there's no question in my mind that London will very soon be Lundistan and Europe will be Eurabia. But it won't be the fault of the immigrants, and it won't be the fault of our Muslim friends, our friends and brothers and sisters in the Middle East, who are left with this religion which did not give rise to the greatest civilization in the history of the world, did not give rise to the greatest achievements in the sciences, in philosophy, in politics, in art, in history, in music, in architecture. That was the Christian world which built that. And yet the young can, for whatever reason, cannot turn their back on it fast enough, as if what it's going to be replaced with is going to somehow be better. Well, I would invite the young people to take a hard look at Islam and just how different it is from Christianity, because Muhammad was not Christ. And Christ's only alleged sin was claiming to be God. That was the only charge that could be brought against him. He did not have 20 wives. He didn't sleep with a 9-year-old. He didn't kill. What did he do? He claimed to be God. Oon, as we say in his halo on the Byzantine icons, I am. But what if he really is? Then you've got an issue. You have a man who lived without sin, a man who is fully man and fully God. You have the fulfillment of the prophets, who was a suffering servant, who died for the people he loved. And that we're going to crucify him again. And when I say we, I don't mean just the laity in Europe. I mean we, the clergy. Look at the German bishops. Have they lost their mind in the Catholic Church? Look at the preoccupation with the Bishop of Rome in discussing LGBTQ issues, as if we need more celibate men in the world. And you've got this Catholic population that since the 7th century has made it a matter of canon law that they cannot marry. What a mistake. You've got a huge body of men, the vast majority of which were never truly called to celibacy. There is such thing as celibacy. There are people called to it. It is real. It is legitimate. It is ascetis. It is asceticism that is real. It belongs in a monastery. And now you have all of this misconduct on the part of us, the clergy. And to the extent that there is a problem with declining Christianity, we hold greater responsibility. The presbyterate and the hierarchy, the religious leadership, the priests, we are first and foremost to blame, to be sure. But don't turn your back on the church. Don't turn your back on the culture, because what it's going to be replaced with will be so much less. And can Christians and Muslims live together? They can. It's been seen before. There was an Ottoman Empire. It wouldn't be the first time. But take a close, hard look at what that looked like. And you'll see what the future holds. And how that relates to the United States, we see the same trends in the United States with a decline, a significant decline in religious observance. We see it amongst the Catholic faithful the United States, literally falling off a cliff. The Presbyterians, same thing. I believe I read the other day something like 40% fewer baptisms in the Presbyterian Church over the last, I think, decade. So really massive declines, a rise in a sort of neo-pagan Marxism. And what are you seeing? You're seeing open borders, mass migration. Again, blaming migrants for a replacement of your culture and your religion is foolishness if you've turned your back on it freely.
It's been reported that Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, at a political event in Rome, recently said that, quote, there is no place for Islamic culture in Europe. Meloni continued, quote, I believe that there is a problem of compatibility between Islamic culture and the values and rights of our civilization. The Islamic cultural centers in Italy are financed by Saudi Arabia, where Sharia is in force. In Europe, there is a very Islamization process distant from the values of our civilization, she added. According to local media reports, the first mosque in the Greek capital Athens opened in November 2020. About 290 mosques already operated in Western Thrace and on the islands of Rhodes and Kos. It is estimated that Athens is already home to about 300,000 Muslims. The government secretary for religious issues, Yorgos Kalantzis, was quoted as saying that the mosque's opening, quote, sends a clear message of democracy, religious freedom, and respect, end quote. Just months earlier, on July 22nd, a turquoise-colored carpet was laid in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, Constantinople, to prepare it as a mosque for worshippers. Turkey's President, Erdogan, later said during a televised broadcast, quote, my dear nation, the conquest of Istanbul and the conversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque are among the most glorious chapters in Turkish history, end quote. Turkey, which is partly in Europe, has also recently converted the magnificent Byzantine church of Monitis Horas into a mosque. The church's interior is adorned with some of the finest surviving Byzantine Christian mosaics and frescoes in the world. Given what we're seeing, I must ask, can Christians and Muslims live together in harmony?
Well, Giorgia Meloni is right about one thing. There is a compatibility issue. These are very different religions, and they believe in very different things. Muhammad and Christ were very different people. In fact, Christ, of course, was not just fully man, he was also fully God. A claim not made by Muhammad or any other founder of any religion. But once again, not unlike Eva, I think Meloni is headed in the wrong direction because it's really the European secularization. It's the European population turning its back on its own Christian heritage in Western Europe, especially as personified in countries like the Netherlands, that we see a spiritual vacuum and a cultural vacuum, which is going to be filled. And it's personified again in these sort of starkly contrasting comments from Kalantzis in Greece and Erdogan in Constantinople and Istanbul. Here on the one hand, you've got the Greek politicians saying, we're talking about democracy and religious freedom and respect. And none of those words are being used in Erdogan's speech, as he says, I think it's 12 times. He talks about the conquest being one of the glorious chapters in their history, the conquest of Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral of Christendom, of Eastern Christendom. And I think he says 14 times, and incredibly offensively, he refers to a resurrection. Now, I would say this is like listening to two donkeys for very different reasons. The donkey sitting in Athens is completely unaware of the reality going on around him, and the donkey sitting in Istanbul is confusing theft with resurrection. Resurrection looks like the great Cathedral of the Resurrection in Albania, in Tirana. That is a resurrection. For a country that was secularized in 1912 and under socialism declared itself to be the first atheist state, a remarkable resurrection has taken place in Albania that should be observed. And it's an interesting case study. Unlike sort of the Netherlands, it's a country where you see Islam and Christianity, Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox living in complete harmony, frankly. So it can be done, but it's been seen before. So there was an Ottoman Empire and it covered Europe, but we have to understand that there will not be an equality amongst a dominant Muslim population and a Christian population. One will be strong and the other will be weak. So either the Muslims will be strong and the Christians will be passive and they will be subservient to neo-Ottoman rulers, or the Christians will be strong and the Muslim population will be like tourists. And the answer is not a political policy solution. That will never work. And that's why Meloni, who I'm not sure why she's not married, actually. I believe she's not married to the father for a child, I think. Not unlike Eva. We're talking about unmarried women who are espousing country and family and God, but curiously don't seem to live that witness. I don't mean to judge other people, but they seem to reflect actually more of the problem than the solution in their own personal lives. We look at that and we say, well, this is not going to be a political policy solution. This is a solution that has to change in the hearts and minds of Europeans to understand that the greatest civilization on earth, the Western civilization, which is predicated on Greco-Roman roots, on the roots of Christianity that emerged and created the culture. If you don't recapture that, you're going to give it away. And there's definitely going to be a compatibility problem, because I'm not sure that most Europeans think about what Sharia law really means once it takes hold. And when you look at the number of elected officials in the UK who are Muslim, the Sharia courts that are already being set up, the sheer number of mosques, thousands more planned. You see churches burning in France. You see churches being turned into mosques or bars in Ireland and across Europe. And you ask yourself, you say, well, this is a spiritual vacuum. This is a real cultural and religious vacuum. I think, I want to say, going back to the Netherlands, I think 60 or 63% of the Dutch believe that religion does more harm than good. It's a remarkable figure. And I think 50% or more of the population, I want to say, has no religious identity. They're irreligious. And I think 53% answered in a study that they never pray. So, putting aside the theological issues with Islam, I don't hear the Muslim population saying this about their religion. Erdogan sounds very, very different than Kalantzis in Greece. And could you imagine if in Greece you took a mosque and converted it into a church, called it a conquest, a great moment, a glorious moment in your church history, and said it was a resurrection? And of course, it wouldn't be offensive to say resurrection, because Christians, we obviously believe in the resurrection of Christ. And a point certainly not lost on Erdogan when he uses that word strategically in his speech, how incredibly offensive that would be. But Christians are coming off, and let me just blame us, the clergy. I'll just say that up front. We are responsible. Let's blame the clergy, but Christians come off as weak. They come off as faithless, and it's borne out in their statistics. It's borne out in many of these societies and countries that are, frankly, highly sexualized. You look at Athens, you walk around in the Plaka and the marketplace just underneath the Parthenon, and it's remarkable because you see these wonderful stores filled with the most beautiful Byzantine icons, with the most beautiful church items in the stores, and right next to it you see shops selling the most profane and vulgar wares to tourists. It's such a bifurcated consciousness amongst the Greeks, and it's slipping away from their roots. And to the extent they do that, we see this direct and inversely proportionate relationship between turning our back again on the faith, turning our back on Christ and on our religious and Christian heritage in favor of what? In favor of secularism and neo-paganism, in favor of an unchurched spirituality. You hear this saying all the time. It's so popular and it's so ridiculous. I'm spiritual but not religious, which means precisely nothing, of course. But to the extent that there is any bulwark against this shift, I would submit that it is in Eastern Christendom, because we see that Protestant churches really have collapsed very quickly throughout Europe. You see their former churches are for sale everywhere, actually. You look at the Catholic weekly attendance in their Mass, it's collapsed. In Switzerland, for example, you see these magnificent Catholic churches, but they function more like museums and houses of the living God. They maintain them so incredibly well. But throughout Europe, you find churches that are empty. But not so amongst the Orthodox, amongst the Romanians, amongst the Serbs, amongst the Russians. Their churches are full. Their life in Christ is vibrant. Their families are large. Their clergy are married. You see, in my opinion, so much more of a complete manifestation of the church that Christ established on earth. And when you compare that to what, of course, the mistakes I think that the church in Rome, the Bishop of Rome made generation after decade in their ecclesiology, the increasing shifts and changes to liturgy and to tradition, right up into their most recent councils that they've been holding, where they are, I'm not sure what to call them other than heretical, actually, where they have statues of Pachamama, and you see the pontiff, the Bishop of Rome, advocating for this LGBTQ agenda. Has really nothing to do with holy tradition. We don't see that in the East. You see it in the politicians in Greece, but you don't see it in the Church of Greece, thank God. Look at, again, the great cathedral in Tirana, which is resurrected from the ashes of communism, from Marxism. Look at St. Savas and Belgrade. it actually is more beautiful and even larger than Hagia Sophia. That is a resurrection taking place. And maybe many people have negative feelings towards Russia because of the tragic and unfortunate war in Ukraine where so many innocent people have died. But look at the churches being built in Russia. Look at what the eastern lung of Christendom has done and has become. In my opinion, if Western Christian civilization is to be spared, if it is to be strengthened, if it is to be renewed, if there's to be a change of heart, if there's to be a change of mind, if there's to be a true resurrection, then we have to look east, because that is the bulwark against what's this hyper-secular is, secular mentality that is leading to all sorts of darkness and evil. Again, personified in the Netherlands with euthanasia and with prostitution and human trafficking and drugs. And what you see sort of the antithesis of that, as you move further east, there's still this grasping on to Western civilization that we see again in the West, in The Hague and in Brussels. We see the emergence of, and in Geneva, of course, the emergence of all of these global organizations, NATO and the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. These institutions are certainly exerting outsized pressure and an influence over a population and putting into power individuals who are really oligarchs. We associate oligarchy with Russia, but oligarchs exist in many Western countries, including the United States. We have technocrat oligarchs, but they're not democratically elected, and they have great sway and great power over the populace. And unless the Western Christian population of Europe is willing to forego and to let go of the great civilization they built, the only way forward, in my opinion, is to re-embrace a life in Christ. And we see that, thank God, still intact in the East. Because what they're saying now, the political leaders in Europe, have nothing to do with what the leadership in the Muslim countries are saying. And you can just read Erdogan's speech yourself, and you can see how incredibly different the language is and really what they have in mind. It's not move into Europe and we'll all live happily ever after together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya and make s'mores. That's not what they have in mind. They have in mind conquest, because that is part of their culture and is part of their religion. And that's what they will do. And Christians will be subjugated, and they will be made submissive, and they will be second-class citizens to Muslim overlords, as they were in the past. And the church will suffer greatly. And to what end? That will not be progress. That is not an evolution of society. It is not an evolution of culture. It is not an evolution for us as human beings. It is a regression.